40% of you have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse. What the heck is wrong with you? It's free every single Tuesday and Thursday at noon Eastern. The coolest place to be if you think fixing our workplace can fix our world. We got a real treat for you today. We're going to be talking about this core competency for compliance, which I think gets overlooked a lot of the time. So the uncomfortable truth about compliance is that, newsflash, the entire job is change management. So we have the one and only Caveni Wong. Round of applause for Caveni as we run through some announcements here. Thank you very much. We're going to be talking about this ever-present skill that we all need to build in order to build our programs forward to drive that impact throughout our organization. So as we get started here, drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat because your network is your net worth. Neither are big enough. And at least tell us where you're coming in from today and how bad the drought is in your area. Over here in Charlotte, we're dealing with a real big drought type of a situation. We got a ton of new resources for you. So if you have not checked these out recently, you absolutely should. We have podcasts coming out every single week. We have webinars coming out twice a week now, a ton of toolkits and things like that. And there is so much thought leadership going on in our space. So if you're not ingesting this stuff, whether it's through the Ethicsverse or through our friends on some of these other channels, you are leaving a lot of impact on the table. So definitely check those out. Also, if you have not checked out the Great Women in Compliance podcast recently, now is your time to do it. I was their man on the street at Compliance Week. We did a bunch of interviews and got a bunch of great takeaways from attendees there. So that's a quick little 20-minute podcast that you're going to absolutely love. And you're also going to love this new book from the one and only Reed Blackman. So he is the top, in my book, which is, I guess, the book, he is the top AI ethicist in the world, and he's put out this new book called The Ethical Nightmare Challenge. So if you have not picked this up or have not checked out the session that we did with Reed on launch day a couple of weeks ago, I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and check it out, or just participate in the chat today and win yourself a copy of this book. What's great about this book is that it boils down a real dynamic framework that you can actually mitigate risk across the entire risk surface of your organization. The use case for AI is really kind of exploding, and this new technology is going to continue to wash across our shore. Our job is to help de-risk our organizations, and sometimes the policies that we write that take 6 months to get approved through the AI committee don't end up actually working at those points of risk. So check this book out. It's very digestible, and it's really extremely actionable. We've already implemented it in our organization. And if you have not checked out the benchmark report from Ethico, now's your time to do it. So a great channel that we intersect, a great sort of point or a great vector of intersection with the stakeholders in our organization whose participation we need in order to mitigate risk in our companies and execute on our job as ethics and compliance officers is, of course, our hotline. So that whole apparatus, the intake, the investigations, all that kind of stuff, that's a business process that can be optimized. So if you don't measure something, it's not going to get managed. And if it doesn't get managed, it doesn't get done. We've all heard that saying 1,000 times. But the benchmark report has a bunch of great information on there for you to kind of gauge where your program might be. And then a bunch of tips on how you can improve some of those metrics. And again, show better value inside your organization. If you have not checked out our Policy Plus, then welcome to Earth. We just launched this really cool new platform called Policy Plus. And what this platform... Thank you very much. Okay, very good. Policy Plus is our brand new policy management platform. It's AI driven, of course, with all the guardrails and all the best practices that have come out of the Ethicsverse and the dozens of conversations we've had about AI. But this is a next gen platform that allows you to, manage this policy lifecycle process that is really replete with a lot of manual steps and a lot of pains in the neck. So you want to definitely check this out. We have a lot of cool features on there, AI drafting, distribution based on your HRIS system, packages, everything commenting in real time on policies that you're drafting. You can get a bird's eye view of the entire health of your policy management operation in one place. So definitely want to check that out. You can hit a demo on the Ethico page, or there might be a button on the console here, or just let us know and we'll have somebody go ahead and reach out to you. All right, with that, let's get a massive emoji explosive for the one and only Caveni Wong. How's it going, Caveni?
I'm doing well, doing well. Thank you for having me.
So Caveni runs Principal Compliance. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Principal Compliance and we can kind of ease into this conversation, which, you are an expert on change management, and would love to hear a little bit about your organization and then kind of what got you into the compliance space and, what the basis for your expertise is. And I'm calling you an expert, so you don't have to call yourself an expert if you don't want to, but I will vouch.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Principal Compliance is a boutique consulting firm that I started, and we want to work with organizations to put policy into practice because that's where we see a lot of gap. I see a lot of companies having compliance programs that employees actually don't know about or they don't follow. And so this is how we're founded, is that we want to focus on programs that actually work.
So this is, a lot of us get so trained in on the 7 elements and all these kinds of things. And sometimes it feels like we lose sight of what the real game is. The game is the game, and the game is influence and changing behaviors. And changing behaviors means change management. And whether that's a new process or a new policy or a new initiative that we're pushing that requires the participation of human beings in the organization, there's a lot of opportunity for us to improve that. So I'm really excited to dive in today and talk a little bit about how we can better kind of identify a vision for compliance initiatives, why accountability is this linchpin that we really want to reinforce to really drive those change efforts forward, and how to better locate some of the data pools that are going to help us, that are going to kind of reflect the behavior that we're trying to influence. So tell us a little bit about your background and what drew you into this sort of intersection between compliance and change management.
Yeah. So, and the last time we spoke, I didn't even draw this connection. So actually studied communication in college. And I think that's what really led me to doing change management at Ernst & Young. So they had a change management consulting practice where I was at for about 3 years. And I think that's communication and change management. That's just really the basics of really doing anything in the corporate world, because you're trying to change behavior in everything that you do. So that's a natural connection to compliance, because ultimately everything that you're trying to do, the 7 elements, this framework from the DOJ, from the UK, everything is trying to influence the type of behavior that you think is compliant, that's ethical. And so everything really does point to change management at the end of the day.
So I think that's exactly right. And that's an interesting connection, that communication thing. There's, I say this all the time, but, I love this space that we're in. I love ethics and compliance because there's so many facets. There's so many sort of skills you have to get right to build a really successful program and really drive that impact forward in the organization. And again, so much of it ends up like the last mile of a compliance program, kind of to your point, is this communication thing and this influence thing where we're driving changes in behavior and equipping people with new frameworks or new, mental models at those various different points of risk. So I want to walk through, you have these sort of 6 different, I don't know. Let's kind of frame out our conversation today, what we're going to be kind of covering, and then we can sort of start stepping through these various sort of elements of what change management means for compliance. Because I think, in our pre-show and in the podcast, which is coming out pretty soon here, I just felt like this was such a critical conversation to have. And your expertise is one that if we can just borrow a couple of drops from the ocean, the vast ocean of expertise you have, I think they're things that we can start to put into practice literally, right as this conversation ends.
Yeah, no, that sounds great.
Okay, so let's kind of set the stage. Let's kind of talk through what some of these different things, these different sort of chapters we're going to cover today, and how you came up with this broad framework, and then we'll sort of start stepping through these different, these different facets of this change management conversation.
Yeah, no. So just step back a little bit too. So in my 20 years of practicing ethics compliance from a variety of viewpoints, right, from service provider, consulting, and in-house, what people focus on the most from what I've observed is what needs to be done. It's, what are the elements of the framework? What are the policies? What are the requirements? But I'm not hearing a lot of people think about the who, right? Who needs to comply? And how are they different from one another? How are their needs differently? I don't really hear about this stuff. So that's kind of where I start really thinking about change management and really setting the stage for the 6 things that we have to do. And, I didn't come up with the 6 tenets or 6 principles of change management. I just applied it to compliance in the world that I've spent 20 years in. And I think, one of the first things is, well, why do people want to change, right? Why do people need to change? And just building the vision necessary. That's the very first thing. Is are we sharing the right vision? Are we sharing it with enough inspiration and positivity? Does everyone care about it? is there urgency? So that's, the first principle is that whatever it is that we're trying to get people to do in the compliance world, are we communicating it in the best way possible?
So, the thing that I love about the Ethicsverse is that I'm on stage every week. Just kidding. The thing I love about it is that we have great experts on, every single week, and we get really kind of tactical. We sort of bring some of these sort of academic broad concepts down to earth and get some, actual kind of techniques that we can start bringing into practice within our own programs. So let's kind of start with, like, what does a compelling compliance vision actually look like in practice from your standpoint?
Yeah, so a compelling vision has to connect to the business values, right? The business purpose, the values, it can't stand on its own. So something, if your business is about, I don't know, helping people or, driving a certain future, well, your compliance vision has to tie into that because, you want everyone to care about it. You don't want people to just listen to it. It's like, oh, only compliance people care about this. So it has to apply to everyone. And this vision, it really has to have some kind of urgency to it too. Like, why are people doing this now? Why do we care now? Can we do this later? And this vision, it's not just the compliance program vision. It has to be also attached to every change, every compliance initiative that you're trying to do. So if you're trying to implement a new process, it's like, well, what's the vision for this? Why now? Because people don't like change. Our brains are developed in a way that treats change as pain. Like it really, detects change as an error. Like, oh my God, something is wrong. So you want to, be very careful about how you communicate to people, generate that positivity, generate a sense of urgency so that people can listen. So it's relevant to people.
So I love this tenet, the why before the what, because I think giving that why kind of puts a frame around whatever the what is kind of within that frame. So I love what you said. It needs to kind of connect to kind of this broader purpose, or it needs to connect to the business in a compelling way. How do you advise people to communicate in a way that goes beyond just announcements, email blasts, just these sort of stale communications that don't actually, catalyze the change that we're trying to drive?
Well, for that, you also need to listen, right? You really need to understand your stakeholders, know who you're communicating to. And who you're communicating to, you can't really think about the company's employees as one monolithic group. So the more you understand where people are coming from, your employees, your leaders, your stakeholders, the more you know what they care about. And you craft a message that is true to what you're trying to achieve in ethics and compliance, but that also speaks to what they care about. So that's kind of a way to communicate. And then, in terms of how you do that, communicating out, people kind of forget that communication is a two-way thing. It requires the sending and receiving and decoding of that message. It's not one-way email announcements. That's not communication. So, once you craft the right messaging, then you also have to communicate it by creating different forums and using different channels that allows for this two-way communication to see how the message lands, to explain it, to see how people understand it. And that is kind of a true communication plan, is to make sure that the message is understood by different groups of people the same way consistently.
So I think part of influence is sort of, to your point, understanding like effective communication. There's an understanding, but then there's some kind of impetus for change. And so when we're talking about compliance communications or setting this sort of vision for a compliance program that's going to drive the ensuing change, hopefully, fingers crossed, that we're looking for, how do we build that sort of sense of urgency to be that catalyst for the change, especially where, compliance, sometimes the stakes aren't directly visible. You know what I'm saying? Like, a super successful compliance program, it's like nothing's going wrong. So sometimes I think folks struggle with this, like creating a sense of urgency around this compliance change just because of the sort of invisibility of the stakes involved.
Yeah. And, for that, you really have to identify the risk and make sure that your audiences understand the risks of non-compliance, of not doing this thing. Because a lot of times, people, even leaders, don't see the risks. they're like, oh, it's okay to work with this third party, and nothing's going to happen from it. It happens in our market all the time. We work with these random third parties. They might not, because they're not in the ethics compliance world, they wouldn't understand the risk that implies. So you have to explain that to them in the form that they can understand. And sometimes in dollars and cents, right? It's like, okay, your contract that you're trying to sign is $50,000, and you want to overlook this really super risky third party. Well, if this third party turns out to be corrupt and turns out to be paying government officials or whatever, this and that, your fine, for violating anti-bribery laws is however many million. So you have to put it into terms that they might understand. It's like, is it worth risking our company's reputation and legal risks and all of that for a $50,000 contract? So it's really based on your audience to see what they understand, and then identifying the risks in terms that they do appreciate.
You made this point that like a good vision has to be positive. It has to be inspiring. It has to be sort of shared. It has to be resonant with kind of everybody. It has to be sort of something that appeals to everybody. I feel like sometimes compliance departments struggle with setting that kind of a vision. What tips would you have to really kind of connect that vision, or make that vision more romantic? To leverage kind of, are there, not just the sort of logic of we can't get in trouble because, for a very sort of small group of the population is, regulation adherence, a sort of like romantic, thing. How do we flesh that out and add some dimensionality to that vision to kind of get more of that sort of assent from our stakeholders?
There are kind of universal human values, right? Organizational justice is one of them. So I'll give you an example of what I actually have used. So conflict of interest, you're rolling out a conflict of interest disclosure process. Seems kind of dry on the surface, like, oh my gosh, I have to kind of fill out this form and do this and, put in everything that I do outside of work into this thing. But if you tap into this human value, the universal human value, you paint a picture of, okay, we're doing this because we are about fairness. We want to make sure that we conduct business fairly. We want to make sure that you are treated as fairly as the next person, regardless of level, regardless of where you are in the organization. We don't want anyone to take advantage of the company or anyone else because they're doing something unfairly. And this process is going to allow us to do that, to operate fairly, so that we can leave room so that you can thrive professionally by doing what you're supposed to do. So
yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
kind of like connecting to those sort of base concerns or those base values that we as human beings all, think are important is definitely a smart way to kind of romanticize it. But I just want to underscore that because there's always so much stuff flying around in a compliance department. There's so many new loops opening. There's so many, new things to react to. I think a conversation like this is helpful to kind of zoom out a little bit and like reframe and remember what we're doing and what our goal is, and kind of get even more tactical about how we can sort of advance forward, how we can improve our operation, our communication, all that kind of stuff to a greater degree.
Yeah, and then you're speaking with different audiences in different languages, right? So for your general employee population, I talk to them about how I want them to thrive. I want to create an environment where they can thrive professionally, and they don't have to worry about being harassed. They don't have to worry about their coworker getting promoted because they're related to so and so, right? So that's kind of the type of communication that I would have. But for leadership, you kind of appeal to them in a different way. They want to leave a legacy. You want them to leave, a shadow of leadership, a president. You want them to model good behavior. So you appeal to them in a different way, that they have to be above reproach. They have to set good examples. You want people to look up to them and to act according to what they do. So that's a little bit different. You want them to create that environment for people who work for them, who are loyal to them.
Let's kind of pivot to this second tenet, the second tenet of these 6 change management tenets, which is accountability. Why is accountability so important in compliance programs in general and in change management, specifically?
Well, and without accountability, nothing matters. Nothing that you do really matters, would actually change anything, right? If you have all of these beautiful policies and processes, everything that you put together, if there's no accountability for any of those, you know, why are people following these? So, and accountability has a lot of different levels. I think sometimes people think of accountability as just not violating a policy. Well, that's not technically true. So accountability has to do with, whether or not you're filling out the disclosure forms as you should. If you're taking training in a timely manner, all of those are accountability, right? And if there are no consequences to not doing training, if there are no consequences to not filling a form, disclosure properly, disclosing a gift and hospitality, then the policies really have no teeth. And it might not be a serious violation of the policy, but you're still not being held accountable for upholding a compliance culture. And it's important to note that the compliance team does not own accountability. This is owned by the business, right? Business leaders have to own accountability by making sure that the people they manage are doing things as they should be doing, including themselves. And so without that support, without leadership support, without management support, again, there's no accountability, then, there's no teeth to the program. And really,
People love that. People are loving what you're saying. So I think you're exactly right. Without accountability, nothing gets done. But accountability sometimes falls into this kind of afterthought type of a bucket. It's treated as an afterthought in compliance programs in general, and sometimes in the context of change management in particular. What do you think happens when that's missing?
When it's missing, then you really have a paper program. It's as simple as that. When there's no accountability, again, you have something that looks good on paper, but that actually doesn't do anything. And that's the challenge, right? And over and over again, we're hearing from regulators that this doesn't hold water anymore. You can't have a paper program that doesn't actually work. So it's really important to make sure that there is accountability. And again, without accountability, there's no changing of behavior. There's no assurance that the desired behavior is being done.
So how do you advise somebody who maybe fears they have a paper program? I mean, look, a paper program is at some degree kind of on a spectrum. And, the ideal is like, on the one end, we have a paper program that, just kind of lives as a dead document on the shelf. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, it mobilizes every single decision and we've effectively de-risked the organization. Neither one of those things are real sort of states of the universe. And, you know what I'm saying? We're kind of somewhere, every program is somewhere on that spectrum. And we're always trying to advance forward toward perfection, even though it's unachievable. So somebody who wants to improve their program or wants to improve the level of accountability, because again, to your point, without accountability, nothing ends up getting done, even in the context of a well-articulated vision that connects to the business and is romantic and, on and on and on. How would you advise somebody to reinforce or build better accountability structures that feel like reinforcing, kind of call that from a positive perspective, versus punitive, which sometimes can lead to, sweeping things under the rug, so to speak?
Sure. And I think it takes different levels of conversations. So, start by kind of developing a consistent way of addressing consequences, right? So what's the accountability of not taking training on time, right? Think about that. Maybe your playbook is, okay, if you're seeing a whole bunch of people not taking training on time within an organization, you talk to the leader and you say, okay, this is going to lead to your performance review. What kind of accountability measures are you willing to take for any of these, as a consequence? Not necessarily, and that goes to your punitive area. So we don't always want to do that, but it requires conversations. You might talk to the business and say, why do you think that's the case? And take some input to see, okay, well, maybe this group has certain issues with the deadline because they just had this big project coming up. So you kind of, understand that too, and provide some ways to help them, to make it easier for them. So accountability, without applying just punitive consequences, requires working with them to solution things. Maybe a disclosure process isn't designed to work with this business unit and they actually can't do it, then maybe you work with them to identify a process so that they can use it based on the way they do business. So I think that is a way to assure accountability, that you care and you understand what the issues might be for people to comply and you try to fix those issues.
Yeah. It's kind of like a way of being, in a way. I mean, kind of what you described, it's not a sort of rule book. It's really a sort of a universally like applicable just way of interacting. It's like a posture. I think kind of another point that you made, it may have been in the pre-show, is that like accountability that's only reinforced by ethics and compliance is never enough. To your point, if there's no consequences or there's no reinforcement from those middle managers, in your example with training, for example, then things are going to kind of fall flat, or it's going to just, push it over to the compliance department to, carry the weight of the world on their shoulders yet again. How do we engage middle managers who we really need to be sort of extensions of us in many cases to reinforce that accountability? Does that come through just building better relationships with them? Does that come through pulling, tone at the top into the, posture of the organization? Like, again, I'm trying to ask this question from the context of somebody who's probably somewhere on the middle of the spectrum, who sees some opportunities to improve their program and drive more accountability forward.
Sure. Middle managers are often overlooked as a group, right? So a lot of times, we have policies that say, if you have any questions, ask your manager. But a lot of managers don't really get more than that, right? They don't necessarily know more than your average employee. And so they're often overlooked. So absolutely, you need to have forums where middle managers can provide their input into compliance processes to see what they're challenged with, if they have any issues complying with certain things, maybe it doesn't work with their business processes, or maybe they don't have enough skills. And, so even though ethics compliance does not own accountability, we own giving the ability, helping people comply with our processes. And so that's also a step that is often missed, right? We are a lot of times stretched for resources. And so we create a policy from headquarters, from global, that's like, okay, this seems to make sense for everyone. Everyone signed off on it on the global level. So let's roll this out. Let's roll this process out without taking the time to understand how business is done in the different business units, the different functions, to see if this is even realistic for them. So we can't really enforce accountability and consequences if we roll out processes and policies that people actually can't comply with. So that kind of goes to the next point on this change management principles, is to involve stakeholders so that you can overcome resistance. People can't comply if they literally don't know how, or if your processes are not written with them in mind. So you really have to do the homework, talk to leadership, talk to your middle managers, talk to as many people as you possibly can, within your available resources, to see what their perspectives are before you come up with a policy or process that you want people to comply with.
I want to dive into this thing, define the hinge, because I think this is, as I was kind of prepping for this conversation, and again, from my standpoint, the entire job is change management. We're always getting new things. There's always new initiatives. Like, we have to continually manage change. We have to continually influence behavior in the organization. I find that, everybody resonates with accountability. It's easy to kind of talk about the why, behind the what. It might take a little bit of kind of creative elbow grease, so to speak, to, connect your initiative to something that resonates with everybody. But where a lot of things sort of fall flat, I think, is on this find the hinge thing. But before we dive into that, Lance, hey, Lance, thanks for this question. I want to share this with you and try to get your perspective on it. We'll do a real-time advice here, okay? So Lance said, here's something I encounter and wonder if it falls under this concept of change. There's no issue in my organization about obeying federal and state laws, regulations, et cetera. Everybody understands the consequences, but in my opinion, we in compliance also have to uphold our internal policies, whether speaking up if they are ineffective, or to let colleagues know it's just as important to the organization to follow them as well as the laws. Therein is my challenge. What do you kind of, and maybe we'll get to this a little bit later, but what's your reaction to this kind of conundrum that Lance is dealing with?
There really should be no difference in an ethics compliance program in terms of upholding internal policies and the law. We're not enforcement agencies within the company. I mean, we are there to uphold our values, the company's values and policies, and which should also comply with the law. And so there really should be no difference. And then if your organization is struggling to have people comply with a policy that is not also the law, then I think you kind of have to run the whole change management process and the whole ethics and compliance program process too, to get the right tone from the top, to really start building the culture, to get people to care about the internal policies and values, right? You develop a vision. Start with that. Develop a vision of why people should, comply with policies and should care about values, and tying that to the business. So hopefully you can find something in there that is inspirational and positive, and build a compliance program based on that, whether or not it's the law or the internal policies or values, because people should care about, justice and honesty and all that kind of stuff that has nothing to do with the law.
Right. That's everything you said there resonated with me. I want to share what Wendy said, the one and only Wendy Badger. How's it going, Wendy? Her response to Lance was, "This is where I found policy committees where the business has representative present comes in handy. The business then is involved in the creation and the development of the policies, so we know that they'll work in practice." And that really is a great that resonates with this next section what we're going to be talking about. Before we leave accountability, though, we have a great question from Allegra. I just want to kind of cover this and get your perspective on this. Is Caveni the best or what? My gosh, this is awesome. Okay, Allegra said, what strategies have you seen work to create a culture of accountability where individuals take ownership of their work rather than defaulting to the not me, finger pointing, relying on others to pick things up? This is kind of the jump ball risk that exists in every organization. Like, what strategies have you seen, like super tactical, to address those sort of gaps between the human beings and the work that needs to be done?
In those situations, I feel like it's kind of, you build a culture by cases, right? You find an issue where this is happening. You find an organization where it is finger pointing, where, someone might be saying, oh, I didn't report this because it's someone else's issue, right? So when you find a situation like that within kind of a microculture of a company, you address it, you talk to the managers, you point out the risks, you point out how this is damaging the group and ultimately people's jobs, and then you point a better way forward. Right? You're like, okay, you should act as, someone who cares about the health of this company, regardless of whether or not it's your job, because it's everyone's job, right? You paint a picture, you set a right way forward. And then from that instance, you learn from it, you apply it in another situation, or you publicize it, you celebrate it with another group, or you use it as a scenario as training or to discuss with overall leadership, so that they kind of, they also set the right tone of like, this is what people should be doing. So I think, if you are faced with a situation like that, you kind of consistently try to have this approach where you're setting the right example of how you should act instead of, the problematic one, or the one that's owning, the thing, and then hopefully kind of build the momentum with leadership support.
So let's, I love that. I think that's exactly spot on. We have to sort of set this vision, but the correction happens. It's like you chart a path to, drive to another city. Along the way, there's all these corrections that you make with the car. And at those points of, things going wrong or somebody not following the vision, if you're not reinforcing those things, either yourself as a department or, through the sort of culture that is embedded in the organization by middle managers or by peers or whatever, the odds for, what I call kind of cultural drift increase, I think, exponentially.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And there's a saying that says, like, don't waste a disaster. I can't remember the exact phrasing. It's, if a situation happens like that, you don't waste it. You use it as a teaching moment so that it doesn't happen again. That's the worst part, right? It's if something happens again, that could be preventable.
Yeah, well, 2 points make a line, and one weed in the garden certainly starts to turn into more and more as time goes on. All right, so let's kind of go to this one now, kind of finding the hinge, driving better stakeholder involvement, and overcoming resistance, because that really is oftentimes, despite pushing accountability, despite a clear vision, this is where a lot of things end up falling flat. So how do you approach? You kind of alluded to this a little bit before, but how do you kind of start to approach stakeholder mapping before launching a new compliance initiative? Who tends to get overlooked that end up leading to sort of less than favorable outcomes? Like, what do you consistently see on that side?
So for stakeholder mapping, you really have to know something about the business, right? The different business units. What does everyone do? Because you have to understand how differently they conduct business and how different their realities are from each other. So identifying the key people there, and sometimes, just start with the person who's heading up that business unit, and then they might point you to the COO of that group or someone, right? If you talk to enough people, they would point you to the right people who have the information. And so, you start with the different business units, and you start with the heads of all the different functions to identify the actual people who would spend time with you to give you the insight into those organizations. And that's how you start with the mapping. And who gets overlooked again are middle management, lower down from the management level, from the leadership level, because leadership has a different reality. A lot of times they have no idea what's happening, right. Several layers down in reality, because bad. And here's another thing: bad news don't usually travel up, right? So leadership might think that, oh, everyone is compliant. I don't know how many times I've heard this before. It's like, oh, everyone in my group is compliant because, we've talked about the code of conduct once this year. But the reality on the ground is different. And sometimes, depending on your organization, managers could also be pretty junior in the organization, right? They could be, just a couple of years out of school and they're managing someone. So their reality would also be different. Obviously, you can't go out and talk to every single person and every single manager. But the more people you talk to, I think the more you can identify the different realities so that you can build a program and communication and everything else around your compliance program that addresses their needs, different needs. And you have that perspective.
So this blind spot at the leadership level this doesn't happen with me, like everybody's good in my organization, but the blind spot at the leadership level, how do you overcome that? Like, how do you help them reframe reality with respect to what's actually going on? To your point, a lot of bad news doesn't trickle up. There's a lot of false positives that happen at like a leadership level because people don't want to raise their hand, or people don't want to, there's this sort of no news is good news type mentality on the leadership level in many cases. How do we help, drop the scales from the eyes of leaders so that they can be that agent of change, or reinforce the accountability, or reinforce the initiative that we're talking about in an effective way?
Yeah, so I think start with having a regular cadence with the different leadership that you want a relationship with, right? So, that could be in existing meetings that they already have, existing staff meetings, or you might want to schedule, a 30-minute meeting with them every 3 months, just to have the regular cadence with the key leadership people that you need to build relationships with. And then in those meetings, you share information about their organization that they might not know about. So one of the things that I used to share was, speak ups, right? Within their organizations. Well, how many speak ups came up in your organization? This is what's about. And by the way, there are a few of them in the speak ups that are substantiated, and they're saying that, this and that, right? Or they don't understand the policy, or, they, in their group, they operate this way, or, they don't hear anything from leadership. So you're giving them intelligence, and that's exactly what it is. They may not have certain information that you collect through your work, talking to people, managing speak ups and doing investigations and doing training. So you might actually have feedback from people within their organizations that they don't know about. And that's your opportunity in these meetings to share with them, to start opening their eyes to things that, oh, maybe things are not that simple. Maybe there are things that they need to focus a little bit more on in ethics and compliance.
Yeah, and I think what you just described there is kind of coming from a position or a posture of helpfulness. I have some insights that you might not have. There's some things that might not be on your radar. Again, kind of assuming that we're all rowing in the same direction, that we all are wearing the same color jerseys as we're out on the field of life. I love that advice. That's great. The one and only Paula Young had something really nice to say about you. So you ready for this? I'm sure you missed this in the chat.
Oh,
Caveni is the best. She stole this from my mind, by the way. Paula stole this. Caveni is the best. She is forward-thinking, innovative, yet people-centric. She understands she understands that risk is still related to people. And if that is not like if that's not a recipe for what we should all aspire to be, I don't know what is. So thank you so much for sharing that, Paula. You definitely stole that directly from my mind. So with respect to finding this hinge, Caveni, what do you think are some of the most common forms of resistance that you've seen and encountered? How are those sort of consistent across sort of change management projects or initiatives that you've been in part of, both in terms of compliance and, outside compliance, back in your Ernst & Young days? And how do you kind of go about finding and addressing them early? How do you suss them out early? Because I think, the earlier we can find points of resistance, the better. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So, some of the easier things to suss out early would be, people who are not complying to certain processes, right? You have a gifts and hospitality disclosure process that's out there, and you know that this group gets a lot or gives a lot of gifts and hospitality, but you're not seeing a lot of reports. So that is, one thing that people are not doing. So, what I would do is to suggest going to the leadership and say, this is what's happening. Let's do these records, like we have 10 reports over the last 3 months. Does this seem like it's realistic? And they might say, oh no, whatever. And then identify the problem and then talk to people. It's like, okay, why are people not, identify the reasons why people are not disclosing as they're supposed to. And you might identify reasons why, like, oh, they can't find it. It's really hard to find the disclosure link, or, this doesn't work for them, or they just, there's no consequence. There's, maybe the leader is not emphasizing that this has to be done, so they don't do it. So you identify the reasons and then you create a plan to mitigate those, so whether it's like making it easier for them or making sure that there are consequences. If you're finding that the leader is not enforcing it for people, then you find a way to make sure that the leader takes accountability by escalating to someone who can kind of kindly nudge. It's like, hey, this is your job. You have to do this. So it's a combination depending on what the issue is. But you have to identify the issue first, because otherwise you can't have a solution without knowing what the problem is.
Yeah, I think to your point, like, resistance is sort of always a signal that's worth listening to. It's not just something that we have to overcome. There's information in the resistance.
Right.
And I think to your point, understanding what people are resisting or why that resistance is occurring helps us make, again, better bets with our time. Let's move to this next sort of facet of this shape about making compliance easy. This is something that you preach all the time. Talk to us a little bit about what this concept means, how it can show up in various different, change management, initiatives, and where you see people get this concept wrong.
Well, remember, we talked about how change is registered as an error, as pain in your brain. So the least you can do is to make this change, a little easier on people so that they can, just be able to comply without expending too much of their brain power and, their workday into doing something, right? So that's a way to influence behavior, is to make it easy for people. And this is just so important. And a lot of people go wrong, when you have policies that people can't understand, that, that has a ton of legalese because you want to cover every single risk, and you want to make sure that, someone who's a regulator reads it and knows everything that goes into it, but then it actually doesn't work, when an average employee takes a look at it. then that's kind of a failure of making things easy for people. That means you're going to have a policy that people just ignore, right? They can't do anything with. Or if you have a process that requires a lot of different clicks, you go on different things, you have to sign on to multiple different things, you are taking their valuable workday to do these things. So making it easy also changes behavior. It's not something that is just a nice to do. It's not a nice to have. It is directly related to whether or not people are going to do what you want them to do. So it cannot be overlooked, making things easy for people, and making sure that people have the knowledge. If this is a completely new concept to them, you have to make sure that they have the concept. I mean, that they have the knowledge to be able to do what you want them to do, and not just leave them to kind of fumble or, kind of violate something without meaning to.
You talked about, I just want to go back to this stat you gave me that I'm going to kind of botch here. So please correct me kindly. Just kidding. But like you said something like 70% of change management never reaches the ROI. And what was that stat? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. So across change management professionals, this is kind of a statistic that has been, used and referred to for many, many, many years, is that 70% of all change projects, initiatives fail. I mean, can you think of Can you think of anything that is like more dismal than that? Like, so essentially, out of 100 projects that people spend money on, invest money in, 70% are going to fail to reach the project goals. Only 30% are successful. So with that in mind, that applies to ethics and compliance initiatives too. And, every policy rollout, update, new speak up hotline process, all of those are change projects. And if you have 70% of them that fail, that means a lot of them are not going to influence the type of behavior that you want to influence. And then
if you deconstruct that, sorry to interrupt, but 70% fail, it's not like it's an F or an A plus. The other 30% is like a whole other spectrum, I think, of varying degrees of quote unquote success. A very small percentage, to your point, end up actually achieving the actual goal. 70%, zero, fail. Let's go. We got a whole new soundboard today, okay?
I love it.
So there's just a lot of opportunity, or look, there's a lot of frustration, and no wonder a lot of us in compliance whose ultimate job is change management, no wonder a lot of us feel like we have the weight of the world on our shoulders. It's a difficult, lonely job. We keep doing these things and we can't get the, we can't kind of make the connection necessary to drive that forward. We have a huge headwind across the world of difficulty in change management. And I wanted to kind of frame that out because I think I love this statement, make compliance easy. And I think a lot of us want to do that, but there is risk for it turning effectively into sort of a platitude. So how do we kind of overcome that and start to increase the odds that whatever change management initiative we're doing is, not part of that 70% that's, a goose egg?
I think really just doing a few things. I mean, you don't have to be a certified change management professional to be able to kind of increase the odds of succeeding, right? There are a few things to keep in mind that we've been talking about to just kind of nudge your project towards a more, more of the 30%, by talking to stakeholders, understanding them. And, and things don't have to be that difficult. They're not difficult things to do, but they do take effort. They do take kind of deliberate effort and investment of time to get to know people, talk to people, and to craft something that is not just, for the regulators, right? Because ultimately you're developing a program internally, and this is something that I've been recently thinking about too. A lot of people are developing programs thinking, okay, I need to build a defensible program. I need to build something that satisfies, enforcement frameworks and all that stuff. But the majority of companies, they build compliance programs that may never seen, hopefully will never seen an enforcement agencies have been under an enforcement scrutiny, right? So why are we doing all of this? This is to develop and to create a work environment that is actually positive, that actually adds to business value, that reduces voluntary turnover, all of that different things. And so so if you're spending money doing that, why wouldn't you take the time to figure out how to do it, how to use your precious resources so that people actually can do what you want them to do, right? As opposed to just kind of creating a whole bunch of things that sit on the shelf.
Well, I mean, that's such a powerful question that you just posed. Like, what's the point? Why are we doing this? Like, why are we actually doing it? Sometimes the answer is, in actuality, we're trying to appease a regulator. And sometimes we inadvertently end up kind of doing that. When we can zoom out to your point and say, like, we're trying to drive some change in behavior throughout the organization or whatever, that reframe can often allow us to trim away some of these things that are not actual needle movers, that are, crowding out the real work that we are hired to do within our organizations, like to your exact point. And that kind of leads us to this next facet of your approach here, which we're up to 4,000 emojis on a Tuesday. Okay, this is like a new record. So if you were worried about this, Caveni, don't be worried. Okay, we're crushing it. You make this point that activity is an impact, which can kind of be a hard, yes, that's great. I agree. We all agree with that. But like in actuality, sometimes we do think that the activity is the impact because it's the only thing that like we can measure. When we really care about outcomes, we don't kind of care about activities to some degree. So let's kind of talk through this concept of activity is an impact, where you see people get that wrong, and how we might be able to reframe this kind of critical element of change management.
I think measuring activity a lot of times is, just what most people do, right? It's easy. And then you pass it on to the board, to management, and then you're off doing your next thing. And I think the opportunity is to measure things that actually make a difference, but those data points might be harder to come by. You might need to brainstorm a little bit more to see where they come from, because they might not be things that neatly show up in the system. So these might be things like, you have a certain number of speak up reports and you can track how quickly they close, this and that. But what if you go back to every person who had spoken up through the system and you ask this person afterwards to see, how long did you wait to report this? What makes you report this? What makes you feel safe enough to report this? And gather a couple of points, right? Mm-hmm. Of data points. And then you collect that over time to see if that trend changes. That is what measures impact, not just activity. And then, not to say that speak up reports, for example, or training reports or training stats don't mean anything, but speak up reports, the volume of reports, if you track the trends, and I know a lot of you guys are already doing, if you track the trends, if you see a huge increase, that, and if you see the increase right after a communication push or some kind of training, then you can kind of tie the two together and say, oh, the training actually makes a difference. So I think there are a lot of data points, within organizations that you can brainstorm about. I know it's easier said than done. I can't say that, when I was in-house, I was doing this perfectly, but, I think if there's a will, there's a way, right? If you can kind of be creative, step out of the box for a little bit and think what can you be doing? Just collect one thing, one data point, and do that consistently over time to see if that doesn't lead you to some outcome measurements.
Before we start having people drop off here, I wanted to share this because I think I may have skipped over this on accident. Or maybe it's just because I only wanted to give it to the people that stayed. Okay, just kidding. Hit this QR code. Joa will share this in the chat as well, and this will be sent around to everybody, all the Ethicsverse members, which of course it's free, as I say. But scan this now. Caveni put together this really cool takeaway. I think it's like a 2-page document that has a bunch of the takeaways from today, a bunch of the best practices, and it's definitely worth downloading. It's definitely worth your time just to at least be able to go back and reference this conversation, because there's probably opportunities for more improvement in the change management processes that are kind of running throughout your entire operation. We have two more topics that I want to kind of blast through here. I want to talk about this one, compatibility compounds. Where do you think, like, what is the essence of this point, Caveni, and where do you see gaps in change management regarding this compatibility piece?
Yeah, so I think the more change you do, the easier it becomes. So within change management, you talk about kind of building change capability, right? The more you change, the more you build the capability to change. So within ethics compliance as well, and this goes back to creating a culture that cares about doing the right thing. Once you kind of get people to do certain things and tie that to kind of a higher purpose for, whether it's universal human value or to organizational values, then you kind of tie the next behavior to that as well. And you celebrate it. You don't, again, back to your point, Nick, earlier about not making consequences punitive. You kind of celebrate it. You say like, yay to, these people,
Right.
For doing the right thing, we
kind of that positive
are now
reinforcement.
a healthcare company. Absolutely. So that's the capability compounding on itself.
That often gets lost in the mix. I think there is, negative reinforcement, of course, is definitely a control mechanism that definitely influences behavior. But that positive reinforcement is such a critical element. It's an incentive in practice, or it's an incentive in action. And we have to be able to kind of dance between both of those, not just slapping the hand, but also giving the gold star, for the behaviors that we want to see. Briefly, I want to share this with you because I've kind of mixed feelings on it. My friend Kim at Compliance Week was sharing how some organizations in China where she lives and works they do like these public shaming things if somebody violates a policy, where they will publish across the entire company, this person violated the policy, and that manager has to get up in front of their team, which is extremely shameful, and get in front of their team and acknowledge that they violated the policy and so forth. What do you think about that from a compatibility standpoint? Or like, what do you think about that as a best practice? Because like that's definitely some accountability with teeth. You know what I mean?
I don't think that can pass a lot of employment laws in a lot of countries.
Okay.
The public shaming. But yeah. And also I think that might be kind of cultural too. I personally wouldn't publicly shame somebody, but I would have a direct conversation with somebody, provided that the person is not terminated by the violation.
Right.
And to make sure that that person understands the consequences of their actions and to never do it again, and how it hurts the company or the people around that person.
Well, I'm going to try it with my kids, and I'll come back and let you guys know how that goes. Okay. I love it. Okay. Let's go with this last one. 5,600 emojis. I've never seen anything like it on a Tuesday. Talk to us about this one as we wrap up. Start with the who. What does this mean? Why do people get this one wrong? It seems obvious. A lot of people, I think, start with the why. You argue to start with the who. Talk to us about that.
If there is one takeaway from today, I hope ethics and compliance professionals, I hope all of you would consider who it is that you want to influence behavior for, right? And then go from there, and to talk to as many of the who as possible so that you have the insight and intelligence you need to improve your program.
I love that. We can't do our job without human beings. We have to we need the participation of the human beings within our organization in order to do our job and build an effective program, to your exact point. And if we lose sight of that, and our lives live on words on a page, on a document, on an email, on whatever, then you can kind of lose the plot a little bit. And so I think I love this as the thing to wrap up with. The big takeaway: if we're not thinking about the who, we're not thinking about the people, if we're not connecting our work to those human beings who we're trying to influence, the odds of it falling flat are just so much higher.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And the benefit of talking to as many people as you can is that you develop the relationships so that your job gets easier. And who doesn't like that?
Yeah, who doesn't like an easier job? And really, like, I think the more we humanize ourselves, the more we humanize our compliance program, the more we recognize, bring humans to the front of what we're trying to achieve in terms of influence and impact and all those kinds of things. I think it makes the job a lot more enjoyable. It makes it a lot more exciting. And a lot of the magic that is inherent to the compliance department, which again gets sometimes crowded out because there's so much stuff flying around and we're viewed as a cost center and we feel disconnected from the business, all that starts to kind of evaporate away. And I don't know, I mean, we're all kind of built for impact. You know, Wendy said something to me many years ago. Wendy Badger said something to me many years ago as a personal motto that I kind of adopted and probably yelled at my kids 100 times, which is like, leave it better. And like, you're going to leave it better for the generation that follows, or the people that are coming after you, or for the human beings that are, you know, living in this environment, whether that's our company or our entire world. So losing sight of this thing on who we're going to leave it better for, it's for somebody else, can do a lot to kind of lose some of the magic and kind of dim some of the brightness out of this amazing industry that we're a part of. And I don't know, we're just at such a cool point in the progression of our industry. The next, you know, I say this all the time, but the next 10 years can look way different than the last 10 or 20 years, but it's going to take us kind of, you know, adopting and like digesting a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. So drive more change forward, keep those humans in the loop, so to speak, keep your focus on the human beings that you're trying to influence. And there's a lot of fun to be had in this space. So let's get one more massive emoji explosion for the one and only Caveni. Caveni, this was a phenomenal conversation. We blew out some records. Remember, you're at 7,000 emojis. This is wild. I love it. So thank you so much for coming. Check out Caveni online. Definitely download this compliance as a change agent, takeaway. You're absolutely going to love it. And check out Principal Compliance, her boutique firm. Reduce your risk that you wind up in that 70% by having a conversation with Caveni. And if you are around Thursday, you're not going to want to miss it. We got the one and only Doug Heilman talking about how to, you know, master the language of audits. We all have to interact with auditors, whether they're internal, whether they're external. He has a really cool takeaway as well for that. So, you know, we're just keep giving out takeaways. We're giving out credits. We're giving out books. And you're not going to want to miss that on Thursday. And then next Tuesday, we are diving deep on the healthcare benchmark report. We're the only company in the industry that has this healthcare focus and this healthcare concentration. So we're going to be going through our healthcare benchmark report so we can see some, you know, insights and drive forward. So this is such an exciting time to be alive. Thank you all for coming. We will see you Thursday. Take care.